He wasn't supposed to survive the winter. The cold had a way of deciding things out here, quiet and final, like a door closing without a sound. The wind moved through the empty streets of Spokane like it owned them, carrying the smell of damp concrete, rust, and something faintly bitter from the nearby rail yard. Daniel Hayes pulled his coat tighter, though it barely helped. It had once been a Marine Corps field jacket, now worn thin at the elbows, the fabric stiff with age and weather. Beneath it, his breath came slow, visible in the freezing air, each exhale a reminder that he was still here, still holding on. At his side, a German shepherd named Rex lay curled against the concrete wall, his thick sable coat dusted with frost, amber eyes half open but watchful even in rest. The dog's ears twitched at every passing sound, every distant footstep, every engine humming through the night. They had learned together that survival wasn't loud. It was patient. It was quiet. It was choosing to stay one more hour when everything in you said lie down and disappear. Daniel shifted slightly, the cardboard beneath him crinkling, offering little protection from the cold seeping up through the ground. He hadn't always been here. There was a time when mornings meant coffee in a metal cup, boots laced with purpose, orders that made sense. Now mornings were just another question. Would there be enough warmth? Enough food? Enough strength to stand again? He reached into his pocket and felt the small chain resting there, his dog tags. The metal was cold, but familiar. He didn't wear them anymore. Not since the day he realized the world had moved on without him. Still, he kept them close, like a quiet promise he didn't fully understand. Rex lifted his head suddenly, nose twitching, catching something in the air. Not danger. Not exactly. Something different. Daniel followed the dog's gaze down the empty street, where a pair of headlights cut through the darkness, slow and uncertain. A car, too clean for this part of town, rolled to a stop near the curb, engine idling softly like it didn't belong in the silence. Daniel didn't move. He had learned not to expect anything from moments like this. People didn't come here unless they had no choice. The passenger door opened. A woman stepped out, her coat dark against the pale glow of the streetlight, her movements careful but unsteady, like she was carrying something heavier than what could be seen. Rex stood now, alert but calm, his body leaning slightly forward, sensing what Daniel could not yet see. The air shifted. Not colder. Just different. The kind of moment that doesn't announce itself but changes everything anyway. Daniel watched, his tired eyes narrowing just enough to focus, as the woman took a step, then another, before pausing like she wasn't sure where to go. He could have looked away. He could have stayed where he was, wrapped in the small, fragile routine that kept him alive. But something in Rex's stillness, in the way the dog didn't bark, didn't retreat, told him this wasn't just another passing shadow. This was something else. And sometimes, without warning, something else becomes the reason everything begins again. The woman did not collapse, not in the way Daniel had seen before, not sudden, not loud, but something quieter, like a candle losing its strength against a draft. She steadied herself against the side of the car, her hand pressing flat against the cold metal as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. Rex stepped forward first, slow and deliberate, his paws silent against the pavement, his eyes fixed on her with a calm that felt almost human. Daniel rose after him, joints stiff, breath catching as the cold bit deeper now that he was moving, but he did not stop. There was a distance between them, maybe 20 feet, maybe less, but it felt like crossing something larger, something unseen. The woman turned her head slightly at the sound of Rex's approach, her face pale under the streetlight, her eyes searching but unfocused, like she was trying to recognize a place she had never been. Daniel said, his voice rough but steady, the kind of voice that had once carried orders across open ground, now softened by years of silence. She did not answer right away. Instead, she exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold, and gave the smallest nod, as if acknowledging his presence took effort she could barely spare. Up close, Daniel could see the details that distance had hidden. Her coat was well made, tailored, the kind of thing people with steady lives wore without thinking. But it hung loosely on her frame, like it did not belong to the moment she was standing in now. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold alone. Rex stopped a few feet away, sitting without command, his posture alert but not threatening, his ears forward, listening to something deeper than sound. Daniel followed the dog's lead. He did not rush. He did not reach out too quickly. He had learned that help, when offered too fast, could feel like pressure. "You should not be out here," he said quietly, not as a judgment, just a fact carried on the wind. The woman let out a faint breath that might have been a laugh, or might have been something closer to breaking. "Neither should you," she replied, her voice low, refined, but strained at the edges. There was a pause then, one of those long, fragile silences where choices are made without words. Daniel glanced at Rex, and the dog held his gaze for just a moment, amber eyes steady, as if confirming what Daniel already knew. This was not something to walk away from. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the small paper cup he had been saving, the last of his coffee now gone cold but still something. He held it out carefully, not stepping too close, giving her space to decide. She looked at it, then at him, and for the first time, her eyes seemed to focus, really focus, as if she were seeing him not as part of the street, not as something to pass by, but as a person standing in front of her. She accepted the cup with both hands, her fingers brushing his for only a second, but it was enough to feel the difference between them, her skin warm despite the cold, his rough and chilled. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried weight, not because of what they were, but because of how rarely they were spoken to him anymore. Daniel nodded once, nothing more, as if gratitude was something he did not quite know how to hold on to. Rex shifted slightly closer, his body angled toward the woman. Now, not guarding, but present, like a quiet assurance that she was not alone in this moment. The street remained empty, the car engine still humming softly behind her, but something had changed. The distance between strangers had narrowed, not by force, not by obligation, but by a small act that cost almost nothing and yet felt like everything Daniel had left to give. He did not know her name. He did not ask. Some moments were not meant to be filled with questions. Some moments were meant to be carried, carefully, until they became something else entirely. The warmth from the paper cup did not last long, but the gesture did, lingering in the space between them like something fragile that neither of them wanted to disturb. The woman held it close to her chest, as if it were more than just a cup, as if it were proof that the world had not completely turned its back on her. Daniel noticed the way her shoulders eased, just slightly, the tension loosening inch by inch, like a knot slowly coming undone. Rex remained still, his presence steady, his gaze soft but attentive, watching her the way he watched everything that mattered. The car engine continued its low hum behind her, a reminder that she had somewhere to return to, somewhere warm, somewhere safe, and yet she did not move toward it. Instead, she looked at Daniel again, really looked this time, her eyes tracing the lines of his face, the weathered edges of his coat, the quiet strength in the way he stood without asking for anything in return. "You live out here?" she asked, her voice steadier now, though still carrying a weight that had not lifted. Daniel gave a small nod. "Most nights," he said, simple, without explanation, as if the truth did not need decoration. She glanced down at Rex, who met her gaze without hesitation, his tail resting still against the pavement, his breathing slow and calm. "And him?" she asked softly. Daniel's expression shifted, not into a smile, but into something warmer, something that lived just beneath the surface. "He stays because he wants to," Daniel replied. The woman seemed to hold on to that answer, as if it meant more than it should. A faint breeze moved through the street, carrying the distant sound of a passing train horn, long and low, echoing through the night like a memory that refused to fade. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling slowly, then exhaling as if letting something go. When she opened them again, there was a different kind of clarity there, not strength exactly, but intention. "I was not supposed to stop here," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I had somewhere else to be." Daniel did not respond. He had learned that people sometimes needed to hear their own words before they could understand them. She looked down at the cup again, then back at him. "But I am glad I did." The words were simple, but they landed with a weight Daniel was not prepared for. Gratitude was rare enough. Meaning was something else entirely. Rex shifted closer, pressing lightly against Daniel's leg, grounding him in the moment. The woman reached into her coat pocket slowly, carefully, as if not to startle the stillness around them. For a brief second, Daniel tensed, not out of fear, but out of instinct, the kind that never fully leaves. But her hand emerged holding nothing more than a small folded card. She hesitated, then extended it toward him. Daniel looked at it, then at her, unsure. "It is just a name," she said gently. "In case you ever need anything." He did not take it right away. Not because he did not want to, but because he did not know what it meant to accept something like that anymore. Rex's ears flicked once, as if urging him forward. Slowly, Daniel reached out and took the card, his fingers brushing against hers again, the warmth still there, steady and real. He glanced down at it briefly, the letters clean and precise under the streetlight, then slipped it into his pocket without reading it fully. Some things, he knew, were not meant to be understood all at once. The woman watched him for a moment longer, as if memorizing something she could not quite name, then gave a small nod, more to herself than to him. She turned back toward the car, each step more certain than the last, the hesitation gone, replaced by something quieter, something resolved. Rex followed her movement with his eyes until she reached the door and paused, her hand resting on the handle. She looked back one final time, not at the street, not at the car, but at Daniel and Rex standing together in the cold, and there was something unspoken in that look, something that felt less like goodbye and more like a promise that had not yet found its words. Then she slipped inside, the door closing softly, and the engine rose slightly as the car pulled away, its headlights fading into the distance until the street returned to its familiar emptiness. Daniel stood there a moment longer, the night settling back around him, the cold returning to its place, but something inside him had shifted, something small but undeniable, like the first crack of light before dawn. The sound of the engine faded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before, as if the night itself had taken notice of what had just passed through it. Daniel stood still for a moment, his eyes fixed on the empty stretch of road where the car had disappeared, as if expecting it to return, as if something unfinished might come back for him. But nothing did. Only the wind, slipping between buildings, carrying that same cold scent of iron and distant smoke. Rex exhaled softly and leaned into Daniel's leg again, a quiet reminder that the moment had ended, but not without leaving something behind. Daniel reached into his pocket slowly, his fingers brushing against the folded card. He pulled it out, turning it over under the dim streetlight, the paper clean, uncreased, untouched by the kind of life he had been living. For a second, he hesitated, then unfolded it fully. The name stared back at him in simple black print, sharp and certain, the kind of name that belonged to offices, to doors that opened when you knocked, to places where people were expected. Eleanor Whitmore. Daniel read it once, then again, as if repetition might make it feel more real. Rex shifted slightly, his nose lifting toward the card, catching the faint scent still lingering on it, committing it to memory the way he did with everything important. Daniel let out a slow breath and slipped the card back into his pocket, deeper this time, like something worth keeping safe even if he did not yet understand why. The cold pressed in again, reclaiming its place, and Daniel returned to the wall where he had been sitting before, lowering himself carefully onto the cardboard. Rex curled beside him without hesitation, his body warm, steady, a living shield against the night. Time moved the way it always did out here, slow but relentless, measured not in hours but in endurance. The streetlights flickered occasionally, casting uneven shadows that stretched and shrank with the passing of unseen clouds. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to rest in that thin space where memory and present blurred together. He thought about the way she had looked at him, not with pity, not with fear, but with something closer to recognition, as if she had seen a version of him the world had forgotten. It unsettled him in a way he could not explain. Rex's breathing deepened beside him, calm and rhythmic, grounding the moment, keeping it from drifting too far. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed, followed by the echo of footsteps that quickly disappeared. Life continued, indifferent as always. But beneath that indifference, something quieter had begun to take root. Daniel did not name it. He did not need to. He simply held on to the feeling, the way one might hold on to the last bit of warmth before it slips away. The hours passed, the temperature dropping further, the kind of cold that crept into bone and settled there. Daniel pulled his coat tighter again, his hand instinctively returning to his pocket, fingers brushing against the card once more. It was still there. Real. Not imagined. He did not know what he would do with it. He did not know if he would ever use it. But for the first time in a long while, the future did not feel like an empty stretch of road with no end. It felt uncertain, yes, but not entirely closed. Rex stirred slightly, lifting his head just enough to glance at Daniel, their eyes meeting in the dim light. No words were needed. They had both felt it. Something had changed, not loudly, not in a way the world would notice, but in the quiet space between one moment and the next. Daniel leaned back against the wall, his gaze lifting toward the dark sky above, where no stars could be seen through the low clouds. Still, he looked, as if expecting something beyond sight. And for the first time in a long time, he did not feel completely alone in that search. Morning did not arrive all at once, it crept in slowly, like a hesitant promise, the kind that had been broken too many times to be trusted right away. The sky shifted from black to a dull grey, the clouds hanging low over the city, pressing down on the rooftops and empty streets. The cold remained, stubborn and unmoved, but the darkness began to loosen its grip. Daniel opened his eyes before the sun had fully risen, the habit of years pulling him back from restless half-sleep. Rex was already awake, his head lifted, ears alert, watching the quiet world as it began again. There was a stillness to early morning that Daniel had come to understand, a fragile calm before the noise returned, before people filled the sidewalks and forgot to see what had been there all night. He sat up slowly, his back stiff, his breath steady as he rubbed his hands together for warmth. For a moment, nothing felt different. The same street. The same cold. The same uncertainty waiting just beyond the next hour. But then his hand brushed against his pocket and he remembered. The card. He pulled it out again, holding it closer now in the pale light of dawn. Eleanor Whitmore. The name looked different in the morning, less distant, less like something imagined. He turned it over once more, as if expecting something new to appear, but it remained simple, quiet, unchanged. Rex leaned closer, his nose brushing lightly against Daniel's hand, as if reminding him that whatever it meant, it was real. Daniel slipped the card back into his pocket, but this time there was intention in the movement, a decision forming even if it had not yet taken shape. The city began to wake around them, faint sounds of doors opening, engines starting, footsteps echoing along the sidewalks. A man passed by across the street, coffee in hand, eyes forward, not noticing them. A woman hurried past moments later, her coat wrapped tight, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and distracted. Life moved on, as it always did, but Daniel found himself watching it differently now, not as something he stood outside of, but as something he might still be a part of, even in some small way. He reached down and scratched behind Rex's ear, the dog leaning into the touch with quiet contentment. "What do you think?" "Hey," Daniel murmured, his voice softer than the morning air. Rex responded with a small shift of his head, his eyes meeting Daniel's with that same steady understanding that had carried them this far. It was not an answer, not in words, but it was enough. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting down the street, toward a direction he had not considered in a long time, not since choices had started to feel like luxuries instead of necessities. He stood up, brushing the dust from his coat, his movements deliberate now, less weighed down by hesitation. The cold still bit at his skin, the uncertainty still lingered, but something inside him had shifted just enough to make standing feel different. Rex rose beside him immediately, stretching briefly before falling into step without command, his presence as constant as ever. Daniel took a few steps forward, then paused, his hand instinctively returning to his pocket once more. He pressed his fingers against the card, feeling its edges, its shape, grounding himself in the choice he was about to make. For years, survival had been about getting through the day, nothing more, nothing beyond. But this felt different. This felt like stepping toward something instead of just away from the cold. He looked down at Rex again, and the dog's tail gave a slow, steady movement, not excitement, not urgency, just quiet agreement. Daniel nodded once, more to himself than to anything else, then turned in the direction the city slowly opened up, where streets led to places he had long stopped believing were meant for him. The morning air carried a faint warmth now, barely noticeable, but enough to remind him that even the coldest nights did not last forever. And as he began to walk, one step at a time, there was something new beneath the weight he carried. Not certainty. Not hope, not yet. But something close enough to make him keep going. The city did not change for him, not immediately, not in any way that announced itself, but Daniel noticed something different in the way he moved through it, like he was no longer just passing through shadows but stepping between possibilities he had forgotten existed. The sidewalks filled slowly with morning life, people wrapped in coats, carrying coffee, chasing time, and for once, Daniel did not lower his gaze completely as they passed. He kept walking, Rex close at his side, their pace steady, unhurried, but no longer without direction. The address was not written on the card, only the name, and that alone felt like both an invitation and a test. Daniel knew better than to expect doors to open just because he knocked. Life had taught him that much. Still, he walked. Hours seemed to stretch and fold into one another as the city shifted from grey morning into a pale, muted afternoon. The cold softened slightly, the air less biting, but the weight of uncertainty remained, pressing quietly at the edges of every step. Daniel paused at a street corner, his breath steady as he reached into his pocket again, pulling out the card once more. Eleanor Whitmore. He looked at it longer this time, as if trying to read something beneath the letters, something hidden between the lines. Rex stood beside him, his posture calm but attentive, watching the movement of people, the rhythm of the street, but always returning his focus to Daniel. They had walked miles together before, without purpose, without destination, but this felt different. This walk carried a question. And Daniel was not sure he was ready for the answer. He exhaled slowly and slipped the card back into his pocket, his gaze lifting toward a row of buildings across the street, taller, cleaner, their glass windows reflecting a version of the world he had not been part of in years. For a moment, doubt crept in, quiet but persistent. What was he expecting to find? A welcome. A reason. A place. The thoughts lingered, heavy, familiar, the kind that had kept him still for too long. Rex shifted beside him, his shoulder brushing lightly against Daniel's leg, grounding him again. Daniel glanced down, meeting the dog's steady gaze, and something in that look reminded him of the night before, of the way the woman had seen him, not as someone to overlook, but as someone who had mattered, even if only for a moment. That was enough. Daniel straightened slightly, his shoulders settling into a posture he had not carried in years, something closer to the man he used to be. He stepped off the curb, crossing the street with measured steps, each one quiet but certain. The buildings ahead felt different up close, their presence solid, unyielding, but not unwelcoming. Just unfamiliar. He moved along the sidewalk, scanning the names on the doors, the polished plaques, the quiet order of a world built on structure and expectation. Rex stayed close, his movements fluid, confident, as if he belonged anywhere Daniel chose to stand. They stopped in front of one building, not because it called to them, but because Daniel's steps slowed, then halted, the weight of the moment settling in. This was as far as uncertainty would carry him. Beyond this point, there would be answers, one way or another. Daniel reached into his pocket once more, his fingers wrapping around the card, holding it there for a second longer than before. The edges pressed into his skin, grounding him in the reality of what he was about to do. He did not know what waited behind any of these doors. He did not know if the name on that card meant anything beyond a fleeting moment in the cold. But he knew one thing. Walking away would feel heavier than stepping forward. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears forward, sensing the shift, the quiet decision forming. Daniel nodded once, barely noticeable, then took a step toward the entrance, the glass reflecting his image back at him, worn, weathered, but still standing. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough to keep going. The glass door did not open on its own. It waited, silent and still, reflecting a man who looked like he did not belong on either side of it. Daniel stood there for a moment longer than necessary, his hand hovering just inches from the handle, as if crossing that small distance required more than movement, as if it required permission he was not sure he had. Rex shifted beside him, his posture calm, his presence steady, not pulling forward, not holding back, just there as he had always been. Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound faint against the muted hum of the city behind him, and then he reached out. The handle was colder than he expected, smooth, unyielding, but it turned without resistance. The door opened with a quiet sound, and the world inside felt different immediately. Warmer. Not just in temperature, but in something less tangible, something structured, contained. The scent changed first, clean air, polished surfaces, a faint trace of coffee and paper, the kind of place where time moved in schedules instead of survival. Daniel stepped inside, his boots sounding heavier against the tiled floor, each step echoing slightly in the open space. Rex followed without hesitation, his paws silent, his eyes scanning, adjusting to the shift as easily as he always did. The lobby was not crowded, just a few people moving with purpose, their voices low, their movements efficient. No one stopped. No one stared. But Daniel felt the difference all the same, the subtle awareness that he was out of place, that his presence did not match the rhythm of the room. He did not turn back. Not this time. Ahead, behind a wide desk, a woman looked up, her expression neutral at first, then shifting slightly as she took in the sight of him and the dog beside him. It was not judgment, not exactly, but it was recognition of difference, the kind that did not need words. Daniel approached slowly, his posture straight, not defensive, not apologetic, just steady. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice professional, measured, the kind that kept distance without pushing away. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the card, placing it gently on the desk between them. For a second, the room seemed to hold its breath. The woman glanced down at the name, then back up at Daniel, and something in her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. The distance shifted. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, but her tone was softer now, less guarded. Daniel shook his head. "No," he replied. Quietly. "She gave me this." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had led him here. The woman looked at the card again, then at Rex, then back at Daniel, as if piecing together something she had not expected to see. She reached for the phone slowly, her movements deliberate, her eyes still flicking toward him as she dialed. Rex remained still, his presence calm but watchful, sensing the change in the air, the shift from uncertainty to something else, something forming just beneath the surface. Daniel stood without moving, his hands relaxed at his sides, his breathing steady, though his heart carried a quiet tension he could not fully name. He had stepped forward. There was no going back now. The woman spoke softly into the phone, her voice lowered, controlled, but Daniel caught a single word as it passed between them. Whitmore. The name settled into the space like a key turning in a lock. The woman paused, listening, then nodded once before placing the receiver down. She looked at Daniel again, but this time there was something different in her gaze, something closer to respect, or perhaps understanding. "Please wait here," she said gently. Daniel nodded, stepping back slightly, giving space, his eyes drifting around the room, taking in details he had not noticed at first, the framed photographs, the quiet order, the sense that everything here had a place, a purpose. Rex lowered himself to the floor beside him, calm, patient, as if he already knew that whatever came next would not be rushed. Minutes passed, or maybe only seconds. Time felt different now, stretched thin between expectation and reality. Then, from beyond a hallway lined with closed doors, footsteps approached, measured, unhurried, carrying a presence before the person even came into view. Daniel did not move. He simply stood, waiting, as the next part of his life began to step toward him. The footsteps grew clearer with each passing second, measured and unhurried, the kind that carried authority without needing to announce it. Daniel kept his eyes forward, his posture steady, but something in his chest tightened, not fear, not exactly, but anticipation sharpened by years of expecting nothing. Rex remained at his side, still as stone, his ears slightly forward, tracking the rhythm of the approaching steps long before the figure appeared. Then she emerged from the hallway, not the woman from the night before, but someone older, composed, her presence quiet but unmistakable. She wore a dark blazer, her silver hair pulled neatly back, her gaze sharp yet not unkind. She stopped a few feet from Daniel, studying him for a moment that felt longer than it was, as if measuring something deeper than what could be seen. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice calm, certain, as if she had known his name long before he had stepped through that door. Daniel's brow shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition that something had already been set in motion beyond his understanding. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady, though quieter now, as if the room itself asked for it. The woman gave a small nod, then gestured toward the hallway behind her. "Please, come with me." There was no hesitation in her tone, no question, only invitation. Daniel glanced down briefly at Rex, and the dog rose immediately, falling into step without needing a command. They followed her down the corridor, past closed doors and muted conversations, the air still carrying that same clean scent, the same sense of order that felt both foreign and strangely grounding. The hallway opened into a private office, larger than the space before, but not excessive, its walls lined with shelves and framed photographs, each one placed with intention. The woman moved behind a wooden desk and motioned for Daniel to sit. He did, carefully, his movements deliberate, Rex settling at his side once more, calm but alert. The woman remained standing for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the back of the chair in front of her, her eyes never leaving Daniel's. "My name is Margaret Ellis," she said. "I have been representing Miss Eleanor Whitmore for many years." The name settled into the room again, heavier now, more real than it had been on the card alone. Daniel nodded once, his gaze steady, waiting. Margaret studied him for another moment, then reached for a folder on the desk. Opening it with care, as if what it contained was not just paper but something more fragile. "Miss Whitmore passed away 3 weeks ago," she said, her voice softening slightly, not with emotion, but with respect. The words did not land the way Daniel expected. There was no shock, no sudden reaction, just a quiet stillness, as if the moment had already prepared itself before he arrived. Rex shifted slightly beside him, sensing the change, his presence steady, grounding. Margaret continued, her tone measured, precise. Before her passing, she left very specific instructions regarding her estate. Most of her assets have been distributed according to her will. However, she paused briefly, her eyes lifting to meet Daniel's again, as if ensuring he was fully present for what came next. "There is one property, separate from the rest, that she chose to leave to you." The room seemed to narrow, not physically, but in focus, everything else fading into the background. Daniel did not speak. He did not need to. Margaret turned the folder slightly, revealing a set of documents, photographs clipped neatly together. She slid them forward across the desk. "It is a farm," she said quietly. "Located just outside of Coeur d'Alene, approximately 40 acres of land. It was never listed among her public holdings. She kept it private." Daniel looked down at the photographs, his eyes tracing the outline of open land, a modest house, fencing that stretched into the distance, and something else, shapes that looked like kennels, wide and open, not confined, but purposeful. Rex leaned slightly closer, his nose brushing the edge of the desk, catching the scent of paper, of something new, something distant but real. Margaret's voice softened further, just enough to carry meaning beyond the words. "She did not leave it to you because of who you were," she said. "She left it to you because of what you did when no one was watching." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with something Daniel could not yet name, something that felt less like reward and more like recognition. He lifted his gaze slowly, meeting Margaret's eyes, and for the first time since stepping into the building, the uncertainty in him shifted, not gone, but transformed into something steadier, something that felt like the beginning of understanding. The photographs did not move, but something inside Daniel did. He looked at the land again, at the open sky captured in still frames, at the worn fence lines stretching across quiet fields, at the house that stood not as something grand, but something steady, something that had endured. It did not look like a reward. It looked like a place that had been waiting. His fingers rested lightly on the edge of the paper, not gripping, not claiming, just touching, as if confirming it would not disappear the moment he looked away. Rex lifted his head higher now, his eyes moving between Daniel and the images, his body leaning forward just slightly, drawn to something he could not yet see but somehow understood. Margaret remained still behind the desk, giving the silence room to settle, knowing that some things needed to be received, not explained. Daniel finally exhaled, a slow, steady breath that carried more weight than words. "Why me?" he asked quietly, not out of doubt, but out of a need to understand the shape of what had been given. Margaret's expression softened, just enough to reveal something beneath her professional composure. "Because you did not ask that question when it mattered," she replied. "You saw someone in need, and you acted. No hesitation. No expectation." Daniel lowered his gaze again, the memory of that night returning not as something extraordinary, but as something simple, something he had not thought would echo beyond that moment. The cold. The cup. The look in her eyes before she left. He had not done anything remarkable. He had just stayed. Margaret stepped forward slightly, resting her hand gently on the folder. She visited that property often, she continued. It was not about wealth for her. It was about purpose. She believed some places are not meant to be owned. They are meant to be entrusted. The word lingered. Entrusted. Daniel let it settle, feeling its weight differently than the word inheritance. One carried expectation. The other carried meaning. He nodded once, slowly, as if accepting something deeper than the land itself. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was not uncertain. It was full, grounded, like something had found its place. Time passed, though it did not feel like it. Papers were signed. Words were exchanged, but none of them carried the same weight as that moment when understanding first began to take shape. When Daniel finally stood again, the folder in his hands, Rex rose beside him without hesitation, his posture different now, not just alert, but ready. They walked back through the hallway, past the same doors, the same quiet order, but everything felt altered, not because the world had changed, but because Daniel had stepped into it differently. The lobby felt less distant now, the space more familiar, though nothing about it had truly shifted. The woman at the desk looked up again, her expression warmer this time, her eyes carrying a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken. Daniel nodded once in return, a small gesture, but one that carried more presence than before. Then they stepped outside. The air was still cold, but it did not bite the same way. The sky had opened slightly, a thin break in the clouds allowing a pale stretch of blue to show through. Daniel paused on the sidewalk, his eyes lifting toward that small opening, as if seeing it for the first time. Rex stood beside him, his tail moving slowly, not excited, not restless, just steady, as if he too understood that something had shifted beyond the surface. Daniel reached down, his hand resting briefly against the dog's neck, feeling the warmth beneath his fingers, the life that had walked every step with him. "Looks like we got somewhere to go," he said quietly. Rex responded with a soft exhale, his ears flicking forward, ready without question. Daniel took a step forward, then another, the city stretching out before him, no longer just a place to endure, but a path leading somewhere beyond it. He did not look back. He did not need to. Some things were not meant to be revisited. They were meant to be carried. And as he walked, the weight he had carried for so long felt different, not gone, but shared with something new, something steady, something that felt like belonging. The road ahead was still uncertain. It always would be. But for the first time in years, it was not empty. And sometimes, that is all a man needs to keep going.